A drive shaft. How hard could it be? Not that hard if you don't get distracted by every possible shiny object. And also if you don't forget to do the things that you got distracted from, which is actually the bigger problem, and why I have come up with all sorts of weird personal reminders. See, I already forgot what we were talking. Oh yeah, the drive shaft. We were pretty close last time. We had all the parts ready to go after going back and forth and around on joint types and slip yokes, but this time we will finish and install the drive shaft. And we will also get sidetracked by some decidedly shiny objects. Oh yeah. When we last left, we were real close to having a drive shaft. We just needed to get the length right, and to do that we need to make sure the transmission and the rear axle are where they're supposed to be. With the car lifted almost a foot, the differential is a lot lower than it originally was. In an effort to make the drive shaft more straight, I angled down the rear of the transmission like so. I did this by making a new adjustable transmission mount, and after assembling everything, it was clear that I needed to move the mount to its lowest position. This resulted in 3 problems. The first one, when I designed the adjustable mount, I made this slot for the bolt to go through to the rubber mount. I made it slotted so it would account for the forward movement of the mount as the transmission rotates down, but I didn't actually calculate this. I just sort of eyeballed it, and I was wrong. I had to extend the slot forward another 3/4 of an inch or so. I also added this ring here to protect the bolt head that will go here. I had to cut part of that off and move it forward. Even after that, it still wouldn't work. The mount moved forward so much that the rubber part was interfering with the front wall of the mount. So I got out the fine adjustment device and ever so slightly moved the wall to clear the mount. I'm probably going to remake this mount. I'll redesign it with the correct slot size, move this wall forward, probably make it out of stainless and extend it up a little bit so I can grab 2 of these bolt holes on each side instead of just 1. It looks pretty sloppy right now, but not as sloppy as this. See, with the transmission tilted down, one of the headers interferes with the frame, and there's really no good way to fix this. So I just got out the Sawzall and cut a chunk out of the frame. And it's still not enough. I need to go back and cut out more. Not so worried about this structurally. It's not great, but not the end of the world. I am worried that my frame now has a gaping hole in it that will no doubt collect rain and mud and critters. There must be some way to patch this up. I briefly considered filling it with expanding foam, but that might help trap water in there. I can't really weld a cap on without pulling the engine, or at least the header, and I don't really want to do that. I might be able to just wrap the tube in high temperature tape, I don't know. I'll figure it out later. Actually, pretty good chance I straight up forget this is a thing. Unless somebody reminds me by sending me an Instagram message in a couple of weeks. I'm not one of those save the manuals, all shifting all of the time people. I have 6 manual transmission vehicles and 5 of them are sequential, which is the correct manual transmission for everything. I do think the Viper is one of those cars that's just better with a manual, but I hate driving manual transmission cars off-road, and many modern automatics shift so fast that they're essentially sequential manual transmission cars when you want them to be. So I am considering swapping in a ZF8HP. This is a very quick shifting automatic 8-speed that would be pretty awesome to have. There are some people out there who make adapter kits, one for the later generation Vipers, but I think the pattern is the same, so it might actually work. Or maybe I'll just make my own. I don't really want to do this now. This seems like a good project for future Matt, but with the drive shaft out and the car lifted up, it does seem like a pretty good time to just pull out the transmission and scan the back of the engine for the bolt pattern. Pulling the transmission out was pretty easy. I wasn't sure how to disconnect the clutch line until I came across this video showing exactly how to do it. I love this type of YouTube video. Just a quick, here's how to do this, with no filler, no distractions, no ranting opinions and side quests that have nothing to do with the actual project at hand. Anyway, let's get this drive shaft installed by removing this transmission. The only thing that was a little concerning with the removal was these obnoxious transmission mounts I had welded in. They're a lot bigger than the ones that came with the car, which is good for off-roading reliability, but not so good for staying out of the way. The transmission has a shaft coming out the front that goes through the clutch, so it needs to be moved backward before it can drop down. Removal was not so bad. I just kind of ended up sliding it back and down a bit and then dropping the rear to get the rest of the way out. This ended up dumping a bunch of transmission fluid all over my floor, which is great. Now my garage will forever smell like gear fluid. Interesting note, it's not super clear what fluid you're supposed to use in these transmissions. Dodge originally spec'd automatic transmission fluid for these non-automatic transmissions, but sometime before this one came out, they switched to Castrol Syntorq LT75W85, which I don't even think they make anymore. They switched because of a neutral gear rattle. Castrol Syntorq doesn't exist, but you can use Mopar 75W85 manual transmission lubricant, which also doesn't exist. The current Mopar recommendation seems to be to just go back to automatic transmission fluid. General Motors has a replacement for the Castrol Syntorq, so I'm just going to use that. I think the important part here is that it's GL4 and not GL5, which has some additives that are not good for some transmissions, and the T56 in particular. I don't know how much came out of the transmission, it seemed like a lot, but it was spread out over the floor in 2 dimensions, so I imagine it was less than a quart. I don't need to know how much came out to fill this up since there is a fill port at the right height on the side of the transmission. Unfortunately, the transmission is not level, so I'll have to either jack up the back of the transmission or put the Viper on some ramps so that the transmission is where it's supposed to be before I fill it up. Anyway, I'll do this later, or I'll forget about it, unless one of you ats me on the Superfast Matt Discord later this week to remind me. Another fun side note, this car is a total mix of imperial and metric fasteners. I thought by 99 that most of the US cars were entirely metric, but this one's about 50-50. The suspension bolts are metric, or they were until I changed them all. The brake lines are imperial, except the banjo bolts, which are metric. The transmission is metric, but the engine is imperial, so the bolts holding the transmission to the bell housing are metric, and the bolts holding the bell housing to the engine are inch. Fun. I scanned the back of the transmission using the upcoming RevoPoint Morocco. I will have a review of this scanner up soon, and then I rescanned it with my Einstar. Anyway, getting the transmission back in was not as tough as I predicted. With the bell housing and clutch out of the way, I lifted the transmission up above the mount and then slid it back. Then I installed the pressure plate, the clutch, and the bell housing. Then I slid the transmission forward into place. When installing a clutch, you need to use a centering tool. These tools cost anywhere between $7 and $244. I bought one for $450 that didn't say it worked with the Viper, but seemed to have the right spline pattern. Unfortunately, it had the wrong diameter at the nose, but that was fixed with about 10 minutes on the lathe. With that done, it was time to install the drive shaft. Right after we get the axle in the right location. The axle is pretty close to where it needs to be, but you can see at full compression it sits too far back. I want it right in the middle of this arch. The easy fix for this is to thread the rod ends in on the rear links, but I had an idea. I added 3 holes for adjustability on the rear suspension. I had originally planned on using the front one, but then I had to move the axle back in CAD, and I already made the lower links, so I just mounted it to the rear hole. But CAD is not the real world, and I needed to move the axle forward, so I just switched back to the front mount and adjusted to get the wheel in the right location. Neat bonus for this movement, if you remember previously I had a binding issue with the suspension where it didn't want to articulate when it was near full compression. It doesn't do that now. It does a little bit actually, you can feel it, but it's not nearly as bad as it was, so we'll just call that fixed. While I was back here, I realized my brake line situation doesn't really work. The brake line I ran previously spits the rear line right out at this frame rail, so I moved it closer to the middle. I also added a little loop on the body side to point it forward so the flexible line has plenty of room to flex as the axle goes up and down. I didn't really need to do that to get the drive shaft in, just like I don't really need to wire in the electronic locker, but I also did that. This rear end has a locker activated by 12 volts. On the Jeep, you just flip a switch and then some signal is sent to the rear end to tell it to lock. There are 4 wires and I wasn't sure what I needed to do to make this happen, but I found some info online that said I needed to just supply 12 volts and ground to the 2 outside wires. In fact, Mopar sells a plug and a pigtail that has those 2 wires for a totally reasonable $96. Thankfully, somebody on one of the forums figured out that it's the same plug used on a lot of BMW cars. Pelican Parts had the plug and the crimp connectors for $15, and they're about 10 minutes away from my house. Some assembly was required, but in the end, the BMW part was way less expensive than the Jeep part, which doesn't happen often. The other advantage of doing it this way was that I could add those 2 middle wires and try to figure out what they do. The $96 pigtail from Mopar doesn't even come with those wires. I'm guessing they give some signal back to the car to let it know that the locker is or is not activated. I checked for resistance and voltage with the locker on and off, but I got nothing. Somebody on one of the forums suggested that it might be a Hall effect sensor, and I will figure that out later. Or I'll just forget about it. Unless one of you figure out my address and send me a letter in the mail to remind me. With the engine tilted back up like this, I now have an oiling problem. You see the pan is designed to sit like this, not like this, and with the pickup here, I end up with over a quart of oil not helping at all. Also, when it's installed, the pan dips below the bottom of the frame of the car, making it more likely to suffer a rock hit off-road. So, I made a new oil pan, but we're not going to talk about that today, because that is a whole video on its own. But in making the oil pan, I got frustrated with both the fact that my land speed car is always in the way and the fact that I never have a clean shelf, so I made a shelf for the far side of my garage. Instead of using legs, I supported the shelf from the wall. This allows me to slide the land speed car under this shelf and entirely forget it exists. Just kidding, I have a video on designing the body coming up soon. While I was making this shelf, another distraction showed up in the mail. Custom 3D printed bump stops. These will get installed, but right now they're going on the shelf. Now is not the time for bump stops. Now is the time for the final distraction. One of the consequences of dropping the back of the transmission like this, other than needing to modify the frame and make a new transmission mount, was that my shifter is now real low. Way too low. Is it cold in here? So I need to extend the shifter height. I also needed to angle it a little bit, but this got me thinking, if I raise the shifter, it's going to make it a long throw shifter. I kind of like the way the Viper shifts now, but if I buy a short throw shifter and install it with an extension, that should turn it back into a regular throw shifter. Short throw shifters for the Viper are pricey, coming in at $400 or $500, but this transmission, the Tremec T56, is somewhat common. You can't normally use a shifter from a different car because the transmission tunnel on the Viper gets really close to the transmission. So the only way to get the shifter in the right place is to use this tight 90-degree joggle, but my transmission is a lot lower than stock, so there's plenty of room in here. So for half the price, I got a shifter for a Ford Mustang that had a T56. Then I mounted the new one and the old one to my workbench and measured how much shorter the throw is on the short throw shifter, and it turns out it's longer. Just slightly. It is not a short throw shifter for a Viper, and not just because of the extra length. It has a worse ratio. This is probably because the car it was intended for has an even worse ratio than this and is actually a short throw in that car. So in my genius attempt to try to save some money, I bought a shifter that doesn't do what I need it to do. But it's not all bad. The new shifter is a much higher quality. It has a lot less play. It feels better. I just need to change the ratio. This is difficult, but not impossible. I dropped the rear of the transmission 3 3/4 of an inch, but the shifter is a little in front of that, so we'll call it 3.5 inches. This means I need to add 3.5 inches to my shifter to get it in the right place. The stock shifter is about 5-to-1 ratio. For every 5 millimeters you move the shift knob, the ball on the bottom moves 1 millimeter. I can sketch up a quick CAD drawing that shows the dimensions of the shifter that came with the Viper. This is the shift knob up here, this is the little ball on the bottom, and this is the pivot. We want this dimension here to remain the same. That's what the transmission wants. If we add 3.5 inches to the height of the shift lever and keeping the same throw distance as the OG Viper, we can see that we need to lengthen the bottom by this amount, which we'll just round to 1/2 inch. There are 2 things we need to do to make this happen. One is to order a 1/2 inch spacer from Send Cut Send, actually 2 1/4 inch spacers. The second is that we need to actually lengthen this part of the shifter. This is less easy, but not impossible. I have a welder and a lathe. I can make this happen. I just need to chop this in 2 right here and then flatten each side with the lathe. I'll drill each side for a dowel, make a spacer, chamfer it, and weld it in. Then I started thinking, why not go farther and make it an actual short throw? I can extend this as far as I want to, but I don't really want to. In a performance car, short throw is nice, but this is an off-road car, and it might actually be better to leave it a long throw. And if it's long throw, that means the pattern is bigger. And if the pattern is bigger, then I can make a gated shifter. I took some quick measurements and drew up a gate, sent it off to Send Cut Send, and did a quick double-sided tape install to check it out. I did have to bend up a new steel bar shifter to get it in the right spot, and I got a cheap ball for the top. Oh my God, it is so nice looking. It is so nice looking. Functionally, not great, but aesthetically, excellent. You know what? The automatic. I'm keeping the 6-speed. Okay, we have all the parts. We have the transmission in the right location. We have the axle in the right location. It is time to finish the drive shaft. If you remember from last time, we chose a pretty basic drive shaft design. I got a couple of messages from 2 different drive shaft engineers, both of them basically confirming that the Resepa joint wouldn't work on the angles I'm looking at, and that the design I have is probably good for a while, but definitely not 200,000 miles, which is fine. Apparently, I'm also pronouncing Resepa wrong. I'm told the R is silent, and also the Z is a sh sound, which I've never heard before. This joint was invented by Alfred Hans Schepa. This is in contrast to the Cardan joint, which was not invented by its namesake, Girolamo Cardano. It was first described by Gaspar Schott, who mistakenly referred to it as a constant velocity joint. It was the great Robert Hooke who first pointed out that the joint's speed of rotation was not constant, noting that it corresponded to the shadow of a sundial generated by the projection of the uniform motion of the sun around the inclined polar axis, or the other way around, actually. Anyway, that's why I'm going to keep calling this a U-joint instead of a Cardan joint, but I will still call this a double Cardan joint because double U-joint sounds like W-joint. Wait, why don't we just call this a W-joint? Anyway, with everything in the right location, I jacked up the rear end to full compression, then I placed the slip yoke in place with the dust seal slightly compressed. I measured between the two yokes, measured the length of the weld yokes, and calculated the length I would need for the tube. Last time I mentioned that I was using DOM tube instead of the cheaper tube, which is bent and welded. Some people pointed out that DOM is also bent and welded. This is true, but it's almost always also normalized or annealed, and the mandrel not only flattens out the weld, but also aligns the grain structure and cold works the metal, making it stronger, especially in bending. It's also usually a stronger alloy. It's fine to be pedantic in the comments, but at least be really pedantic. The weld yokes are a press fit into the tube, which is fine because I have a press. Unfortunately, I didn't exactly line them up. Fortunately, I have the power of leverage, and with a 6-foot bar, I managed to get them back in line. I kind of eyeballed these for straightness. I really should have chucked them up in a lathe and measured them for concentricity, but whatever. I test fit everything, jacking up the suspension to full compression and checking slip yoke engagement at full droop. Everything looked good, so I gave them a good weld, and then I had it balanced. I did not balance this myself. If you're looking for a good how-to on this, just do a quick YouTube search. I'm sure this is effective, and I'm also sure it's a pain in the ass. I drove to my local drive shaft shop and gave the guy $65. My eyeball alignment was not perfect, but not so bad that it couldn't be balanced. After a quick paint job, the drive shaft finally went in the car. There we go. Drive shaft installed. Right to the point, as usual. Thanks for watching. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm. This might actually be a bad idea.